Anyway, thousands of ordinary Russians have bravely defied Putin and turned out for Alexei Navalny's funeral today in Moscow. There was a heavy police presence at the church and along the route to the cemetery. Earlier today, a Kremlin spokesman said the Kremlin does not have anything to say to Navalny's family on the day of his funeral. Isn't that nice? And we are still joined by chief political correspondent at The Sun, Jack Elson. And also joining us now is Peter Conradi, Europe editor of the Sunday Times. Hi, Peter. Thanks very much for joining us. I was astonished when I saw the TV footage of that funeral today. I mean, thousands of people queuing round the block. A real crowd turned up to pay their respects to this enemy of Putin, this brave opponent of Putin. And I would suggest that every single person in that queue is a brave person as well, because they'll be facially profiled, they'll be looking out for who it is that's supporting this guy. But a real show that in Russia, if you scrape away the surface, there's a lot of opposition to Vladimir Putin.
Yes, there is indeed. I mean, you're absolutely right. These people were very, very brave indeed to turn out. I think, though, one should point out that, you look at the crowds that used to turn out for Navalny when he was alive, when he was in his heyday, probably about a decade ago. And then you had tens of thousands, you had hundreds of thousands of people. So we're really now down to, I think, the hardcore of the very committed and, as we said, the very brave. And I think the real tragedy is, as far as the majority of Russians are concerned, this funeral just won't have happened because it won't be shown on Russian TV. It's being ignored by the state media, and it's only people who take the effort to log on to opposition channels on Telegram, the sort of social media app, various other kind of sources. It's only those people who will actually even have been aware it was happening.
What was Putin's end game, do you think, in essentially dispatching of his political rival? He had him, hidden away, squirreled away up in a Siberian prison, unlikely to be getting out anytime soon. Why does he suddenly, ahead of the elections, made this move now?
Well, you see, I agree. It does seem baffling. I mean, I initially was completely surprised by it because I thought, what's the point in rocking the boat now? There have been all sorts of explanations around. I mean, the one that is being put out by Navalny's supporters is that there were plans afoot for a swap of prisoners that would have involved a former Russian intelligence hitman who's in jail in Berlin, that somehow Navalny was going to be swapped for him, and that somehow, at the last moment, Putin stepped in and wanted to sabotage the whole thing and had Navalny killed. I mean, they presented no evidence for that, but it's certainly an intriguing twist.
I understand that since Navalny's death, something like 400 dissidents in Russia have also been arrested. So Putin is on the march, as it were. Does he really feel that fragile, that he has to go about business in this way? Is he feeling perhaps slightly vulnerable in his position?
I don't think so. I think it's probably just the reverse. I think he just wants to just sort of mop up these last pockets of resistance, these people who for him are, essentially just minor irritants, and just get them out of the way. I mean, you could say, longer term, maybe he's preparing for trouble. The economy at the moment is doing relatively well, but it's doing relatively well only because it's largely devoted to producing arms, the tanks, bullets, all the other stuff that Russia needs for its war in Ukraine. And I mean, that in the longer term is going to impact on living standards. Maybe he can foresee that discontent will grow as more and more men die on the front. So, and if you're in a situation like that, you've got complete control as he has, then you round up the last of the people that he just perceives as being troublemakers.
Now, on to a slightly different story, but sticking with Russia, a story that I think is really important. I've been banging on about this for years. And this is the fact that we've had leaked reports today, intelligence coming out of Kremlin strategies, showing that Vladimir Putin wants to create mass instability in Africa, stoke unrest using militias such as Wagner, who are also coordinating The mass migration we're seeing into Europe. This isn't new to me. We saw all of the migrants being bussed to the border of Belarus and Poland a couple of years ago. Finland's just had to close its borders to all refugees and migrants because Russia has been sending so-called asylum seekers there as well. We saw that huge armada turn up in Lampedusa before Christmas. Now we're actually seeing it sort of said in the open, this is an act of grey zone warfare, even by good old Ursula von der Leyen. Is this likely, do you think, to change Europe's strategy when it comes to the migration crisis?
Yeah, I mean, this really does fit into a much broader pattern of what the Russians would call hybrid warfare. You know, and you can see also it's not just migrants, it's activities on social media, it's stirring up discontent, be it sending out messages to get farmers, to sort of round up farmers who've been protesting, funding kind of anti-vax protests that we saw in the past couple of years during COVID. All this kind of stuff. I mean, I think generally Europe is getting tougher on migration, partly because the mood in Europe is shifting towards the right. We've got elections to the European Parliament this June, which are likely to see about a third of the seats going to what we will call far-right parties, such as Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France, the AfD in Germany, and so on. So, you know, there is a toughening that's going on. I mean, recently we've seen Giorgia Meloni, the far-right leader of Italy, who's concluded a deal with the Albanians such that migrants coming across the Mediterranean will be sent to detention centres in Albania rather than going to Italy. It's a little bit different from the Rwanda deal that Rishi Sunak's trying to do, but the motivation is the same. It's intended to, dissuade people from coming. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, even without this Russian intervention, which is making the problem, as far as Europe's concerned, more acute.
Can we go back to Russia, Peter? And you alluded earlier to, that more and more soldiers dying, more and more Russian boys dying in Ukraine may work against Putin. Does he still retain, despite what we saw at Navalny's funeral today, quite a show of support for him? Does Putin still retain, on a general basis, the support of the Russian people?
It's very difficult to judge because, this is a society with a very, very controlled media. It's a police state and it's an authoritarian country. I think though it's reasonable to accept that, say, a large number of Russians still support Putin, or rather don't think there's any attempt to don't think it's really worth trying to resist him, which is not quite the same thing. Yeah. There's no obvious alternative to him. There is no other kind of figure like Navalny around anymore, and even Navalny's appeal was kind of fading. So, I think you don't really have to see it in terms of support for him, but there's this kind of, Russian acceptance, I think, of who's in charge. I mean, I know the country well. I spent 7 years there at the sort of latter years of the Soviet Union, and that they accept, Russians accept their leaders in a way I think that we in Britain just don't, or we in the sort of the Western world more broadly don't.
Peter, thank you so much. A privilege and a pleasure picking your brains. Peter Conradi,
Europe editor of the Sunday Times there.
Jack, I mean, it's interesting. I brought up the sort of hybrid warfare through the prism of the migrant crisis. Peter pointing out very adeptly, actually, that when you see this sort of uptick in activism, whether it be BLM, whether it be Just Stop Oil, there's usually a big bot farm with the sort of state-level curation somewhere behind it. Again, things that aren't spoken about. Is it time that we got real and did speak about these things? Because we tend to accept all of these things, the migration crisis, the sort of big push about climate crisis. We tend to accept all of these things at face value and have to go along with the accepted belief that, the world is on fire and we mustn't use fossil fuels and we must accept everybody who comes on a dinghy into this country. And these are actually actively being used to divide and destroy the West.
Yeah, and it's completely in Putin's interest to create upheaval, to create unrest within the West. And it feels at the moment that he is probably actually very powerful and very quite dangerous. Obviously when he first started that war in Ukraine, he received immense pushback and it didn't go according to plan. Now you're starting to see, especially in lots of countries like America, for example, a bit of hesitancy in terms of, funding that war, parts of Europe as well. So that killing of Navalny, it strikes me as, obviously he knew that the West would completely, kick up a fuss about it. He doesn't really care anymore. He's past that. He knows he's never going to be coming back into the fold. This is just about him stamping his fist on Russia and quashing the last elements of dissent whatsoever. I think he wants to spread fear. And, you make the point about our people in Africa as well and sort of driving the migration crisis. You have to look to these sort of characters, don't you?
You certainly do.
It's alarming, I'll tell you that much.